Hello there! Welcome back to my ongoing attempt to review every single game ever on Steam Deck. For those of you that didn't see my last video where I took a look at all of the Siren games running on deck, essentially the goal of this series is to showcase the unique capabilities of handheld gaming PCs. To do that, we're going to test every single version of every single Manhunt game on the Steam Deck. For those of you that are new to the series, here's how it works. Via emulation, I test every port of each game released across both console and PC and record footage of them via capture card. Based on my own subjective experience, I then give each port a compatibility score out of 10 and issue a final recommendation on which one you should play on Steam Deck. In order for a port to get top marks, it needs to run at its full intended frame rate and feature no major graphical issues. Additionally, each port needs to render at the deck's native resolution. I'll also be giving each game a little teensy review as we go along. It's like a bonus, yeah? It's worth mentioning that these videos take a lot of time to put together. With that in mind, I want them to be a service to you. If you like what I'm doing here, give the video a like and maybe even subscribe. If you have a particular franchise you'd like to see tested on deck, pause the video and let me know in the comments. And as always, I'll only be testing through SteamOS, as that's what the vast majority of users are rocking on their deck. Alright, on to the games. There are very few games out there that encapsulate their point of origin quite like Manhunt. Developed by Rockstar Games and released for the PS2, Xbox and PC, Manhunt is a perfectly distilled slice of early 2000s moral panic. Those of you who remember this time in gaming will recall just how much of a reaction Manhunt garnered from traditional media outlets and moral puritans everywhere. Despite the fact that the game looks mild and somewhat dated by today's standards, Manhunt was a new benchmark for video game violence in 2003. 10 years after Mortal Kombat, Rockstar set their sights on redefining adult games, as they so often used to do. In Manhunt, you're cast as James Earl Cash, a prison inmate who's been sentenced to death. After a fake execution, James awakens to find he is A, not dead, and B, the main character in a snuff film. The game's campaign sees you working your way through a series of linear stealth action levels, all framed within this snuff movie concept. Mechanically, Manhunt isn't really doing anything remarkably unique, even by the standards of its time. You do a lot of hiding, sneaking, and executing. It's those executions that were absolutely the focus of the game. Now that we're 20 years removed from their grisly, controversial relevance, they don't really have quite the same novelty or shock value as they used to. Despite the game's lack of innovation on a mechanical level, Manhunt still manages to look and feel peak Rockstar. This was back when Rockstar's titles had this undeniable sense of personality to them, this truly unique aesthetic and tone that felt mature and well-rounded. For that reason alone, I'd recommend Manhunt to just about anyone. Well, maybe not a 3-year-old, but you get where I'm coming from. So how does this evil, corrupted time capsule of a video game perform on deck? We're kicking off our testing with the PS2 version of the game, running via PCSX2 within SteamOS 3.5. The first thing you're likely to notice when you boot the game up is this. Manhunt's lighting, for the most part, is completely broken. Any light source that should have a little bit of bloom instead presents itself as a supernova that engulfs half the screen and pierces through in-game geometry. The game's entry on PCSX2's compatibility wiki outlines a way in which you can use the emulator's built-in hacks to circumvent this problem. However, the wording used to describe the settings we have to change is totally outdated. A user over on emudeck's subreddit managed to figure out how to change these settings in modern versions of PCSX2. However, even after doing that, I faced the exact same set of issues. Ow, my eyes. Visual glitches aside, it's essentially business as usual for PCSX2 on this channel. Image quality is good, the grungy VHS aesthetic of the game is retained well on deck. Frame rate is quite good, however I did notice some occasional drops at points. A mixed bag then for Manhunt's PS2 port. Decent performance and image quality are definite plus points, however the egregious lighting issues that plagued my time with the game really detracted from the overall experience. Taking the rough with the smooth, Manhunt Sony Edition scores a compatibility rating of 6 out of 10 on deck. The next port we're taking a look at is the Xbox version of the game running via xemu in SteamOS 3.5. Now, I say taking a look, but we only get to do that some of the time. After the opening cutscene ends, the screen just goes completely black. If you haphazardly hit A over and over again, you'll stumble your way in-game where the glitches roam free. Now look, I know that as an emulator, xemu is still in its nascent stage, but it's a shame to see Manhunt struggle this much when it comes to displaying a cohesive image. The parts of the screen that are rendered correctly actually look great, and the game's frame rate is a step above PCSX2. None of these advantages can save the Xbox port from being utterly broken on deck, however. Clean visuals and great frame rates are completely spoiled by broken cutscenes and pitch black menus. Manhunt's Xbox port scores a compatibility rating of 2 out of 10 on Steam Deck. The final version of Manhunt we're testing out is the PC port, running via Proton and installed via Lutris. Now, you might already be thinking, this looks good, and you'd be right. The PC port of Manhunt can look very nice with the right enhancements installed. The version of the game I'm running isn't the one that's available on Steam. This particular repack of the game is readily available online and features a suite of optional mods to enhance the game's mood and tone. Now, why am I not using the version of the game that's available to buy on Steam? Well, it's complicated. Over recent years, Rockstar has found itself embroiled in a wholly different genre of controversy regarding Manhunt's presence on Valve's storefront. Take a peek at the user reviews of the game on Steam, and you will find swaths of legitimate paying customers facing incredibly obtuse issues with that version of the game. As it turns out, it seems as though Rockstar is allegedly selling a pirated version of Manhunt on Steam. Not only that, but the version they're selling hasn't been cracked correctly, so the game's built-in DRM prevents you from progressing beyond a certain point. Pretty crazy, and I'd argue a little embarrassing for Rockstar. Anyway, back to the version we're using. In short, the game looks and runs phenomenally. However, it does require a bit of setup to get running. I also had a bit of an issue with the game's controls, which never felt quite as tuned to the deck's inputs as the console versions of the game did via emulation. In addition to that, inputs are referred to as generic terms, so instead of saying press square, it's hey, go ahead and press action 2. All in all, the PC port of Manhunt looks and runs quite well on deck once you put the legwork in to get it set up. Some minor issues with controls drag the final score down, but I'm happy to furnish Manhunt on PC with an 8 out of 10 for compatibility on Steam Deck. And there we have it, each and every port of Manhunt tested on deck. It would have been nice to see the console versions of the game rise to the occasion via emulation. For now, however, the PC version takes the crown. Flashing forward a couple of years, Rockstar bestowed upon us a sequel to a game that arguably didn't need one. Manhunt 2 released for the PS2, PC, PSP and, wait for it, the Wii in 2007. This game has always jumped out at me as a weird anomaly in Rockstar's portfolio. Whenever the studio opts to develop a sequel, to continue a franchise, they typically have some groundbreaking element to pin the project on. Manhunt 2, at least from afar, always felt like cannon fodder, more of the same, just less relevant. Visually, Manhunt 2 definitely outstrips its predecessor, at least on a technical level. Artistically though, it's arguably weaker. The first game was this easily identifiable slice of misery, grungy visuals, that VHS aesthetic, all of that style made Manhunt a Rockstar game. Manhunt 2, on the other hand, feels like a spiritual successor that's been made by somebody else. Post-Manhunt, there were a slew of copycat video games like The Punisher and The Suffering. Decent games by all means, but it was clear when you played them that their respective devs and publishers looked at the publicity Manhunt received for its violence and said to themselves, oh yes please, we'll have a bit of that. The same thing happened with open world crime sandboxes in GTA 3's wake. The difference there was that when Rockstar came back to make new GTA games, they set the standard that everyone else would follow. Manhunt 2, on the other hand, ends up falling in with those copycat games and kind of fails to move the needle in any significant way. Now look, of course, don't get me wrong, Manhunt 2 is still a good game, it just doesn't have the reputation of its predecessor, nor the innovation you typically associate with a Rockstar sequel. Of course, that's all well and good, but how does the game function on Valve's handheld? The first version we're checking out is the PS2 port running via PCSX2 within SteamOS 3.5. This game's entry over on PCSX2's compatibility wiki is riddled with active issues: broken lighting, visual effects not rendering correctly, and shadows not being appropriately shadowy. During my time with the game, I certainly noticed these problems. The shadows in particular looked a bit suspect, especially on moving objects. Without a doubt, the biggest issue I encountered, however, was the game's performance, which is absolutely terrible on deck. The frame rate is constantly fluctuating and seems incapable of pinning itself to the original game's 30 FPS target for even a nanosecond. Coupled with PC SX2's less than ideal input latency, and the game feels remarkably sluggish on deck, and as a result, it's impossible for me to recommend it. Broken visuals, unresponsive controls, and terrible performance all culminate in a fairly miserable 4 out of 10 for Manhunt 2's PS2 port on deck. Up next, we're transitioning from the big Sony console over to the little one, with the PSP port of Manhunt 2 running via PPSSPP. Right from the off, we see a full suite of improvements over the PS2 version when it comes to emulation. Performance here is essentially rock solid, controls feel responsive, and audio is reproduced without any issue. Graphically, we do see a bit of a downgrade moving from the PS2 port, particularly when it comes to textures. Having said that, the game is so reliant on post-processing effects like static and VHS tracking that you're unlikely to notice these shortcomings most of the time. PPSSPP being such a well-supported and mature emulator is no doubt bringing the goods in this case. I'd happily play through the entirety of Manhunt 2 using this emulator on deck. Excellent performance, decent visuals, and a bug-free rendition of the game result in Manhunt 2's PSP port scoring a 9 out of 10 for compatibility on Steam Deck. What do you think of when you picture the Nintendo Wii? Is it Wii Sports Resort? Those ads where a picture-perfect family sits in a DFS showroom and plays tennis? Well, how about this? A man flinging excrement at you through cell bars. That's right, as I previously mentioned, Manhunt 2 somehow ended up on the Nintendo Wii. I'm sure Rockstar were delighted to publish one of very few adult-oriented games for what was becoming the most popular console of its day, but it is incredible to see a game like this on the machine that gave us Mii's. Anyway, can we play it on deck? Well, no, we can't. We're running the game through Dolphin and it looks great, however, the controls just don't work. The very first mission in the game requires you to execute someone using a stealth takedown. On other consoles, this is done using one button. On the Wii, this requires specific Wiimote and nunchuck ballet. Seeing as we have access to neither of those controllers on deck, we're at a loss. Despite looking and running better than both the PSP and PS2 ports when emulated, this version's controls are its Achilles heel. Manhunt 2 on the baby console scores a compatibility rating of 2 out of 10 on deck. The final version of Manhunt 2 we have to dive into is the PC port, installed via Lutris. This iteration of the game is a strange beast. For starters, it isn't available for purchase anywhere, so you'll have to, quote-unquote, hunt down a retail copy of the game through independent means. Once you're up and running, you're definitely playing the best looking version of the game overall. Honestly, it's night and day in a lot of respects versus the console ports. Lighting in particular has had a significant jump in quality on PC, which is welcome. What isn't welcome is the game's control scheme. There are two control schemes actually, and from my testing, the game doesn't support any kind of remapping whatsoever, which is a bit of a cardinal sin in the PC space. Thankfully, some kind soul has created a Steam Deck control layout that you can easily apply from the deck's overlay, and yes, it does work, but much like Manhunt 1 on PC, it just doesn't really feel right. Movement and camera control are skittish, and switching between sneaking and sprinting is unreliable, so much so that it resulted in my death on more than one occasion. Much like the Wii version, the PC port features interactive wiggle the mouse around executions. However, you can turn these off from the options menu. All in all, the PC version of Manhunt 2 puts up a respectable showing on deck. Solid performance and great visuals are somewhat tarnished by clunky and unreliable controls. All of this equates to the PC port of Manhunt 2 achieving an 8 out of 10 for compatibility on Steam Deck. And that's all of them. Every port of Manhunt 2 put through its paces on deck. It's surprising to see the PC version of the game fall behind the PSP in terms of rankings, but in essence it just means we have more options when it comes to playing the game on deck. I can easily get behind both the PC and PSP ports of Manhunt 2, scoring them with an 8 and a 9 respectively. And with 2 games and 7 ports under our belt, we're done. Much like the last series I covered, Siren, Manhunt's time in the spotlight was fleeting. However, it undoubtedly left an essential mark on the industry when it comes to pushing the boundaries of taste and decency. Whilst I'm not sure that I'd be able to stomach a Manhunt 3 with today's graphics tech, I definitely do miss the version of Rockstar Games that produced titles like this. With the arrival of the PS3 and Xbox 360, Rockstar shifted focus somewhat from being scrappy and snot-nosed rebels of the industry to the entertainment behemoth that they are today. Who knows if there'd even be space for a game like Manhunt in today's gaming landscape? We may never know. What I do know is that I'll be back with you very shortly to cover a series that you could refer to as Manhunt's distant cousin. See ya!